Vamos a empezar esta conferencia que impartirán para nosotros los profesores Richard Wilkinson y Kate Pickett. Kate Pickett es antropóloga en biología por la Universidad de Cambridge y en ciencias de la nutrición en Cornell y epidemiología en la Universidad de California, Berkeley. Actualmente es profesora de epidemiología en el Departamento de Ciencias de la Salud de la Universidad de York e investigadora en la Facultad de Salud Pública del Reino Unido. Formó parte del National Institute for Health Research Career Scientist y es miembro de la Children's Society Campaign for Childhood, miembro de la Human Capital Research Working Group del Instituto para el Nuevo Pensamiento Económico y miembro de la Red Internacional para la Investigación sobre la Desigualdad en la Salud Infantil y del Grupo de Trabajo de Expertos para un Nuevo Paradigma Económico. Y el profesor Richard Wilkinson es investigador de las desigualdades y los determinantes sociales de la salud. Trabajó en el Servicio Nacional de Salud antes de incorporarse a la investigación en la Universidad de Sussex y posteriormente en la Universidad de Nottingham. Es profesor emérito de Epidemiología Social de la Universidad de Nottingham y profesor honorario de la Universidad del University College de Londres y en la Universidad de York. Ambos son, como lo dije ayer, autores de un trabajo formidable que desde su aparición y en los años que le han seguido, no creo exagerar diciendo que conmocionó, puso en cuestión muchas de las nociones y relaciones que se habían construido sobre la desigualdad y el estado de las sociedades contemporáneas, en particular la relación entre la desigualdad y los diferentes aspectos de la existencia colectiva en las naciones avanzadas. Se trata de un libro de enorme importancia que además antecede a este nuevo clima intelectual y político que en la actualidad está siendo articulado por la preocupación con la desigualdad. Es un trabajo que, por así decirlo, abrió muchas puertas en esta materia y forma parte de esta, para mí por lo menos, de esta pues gran y prometedora familia de pensamiento social, económico y político de la que nosotros pretendemos formar parte en México, y es la familia que vuelve a pensar al tema de la igualdad y la desigualdad como, así lo dijo el presidente Obama, por cierto, la cuestión decisiva de nuestro tiempo. Los nombres de Wilkinson y Pickett están en ese estante junto con los nombres de Joseph Stiglitz y más recientemente Thomas Piketty, pero también se inscriben en la convocatoria hecha ya por tercera vez por la Comisión Económica para América Latina, en el sentido de que tenemos que convertir a esta en la hora de la igualdad. Frente a la crisis, la hora de la igualdad ha propuesto la CEPAL. En eso estamos, y por eso pues me da mucho gusto darles la bienvenida a Katie y a Richard, y pues los escuchamos.
Muchas gracias. Y siento que Richard y yo no podemos hablar en español. Estamos muy felices de estar aquí con ustedes en México, pero hablamos en inglés. Siento. Before we start, we want to thank very much the University Program for Development, PUED, here in Mexico City, and the Regional Center for Multidisciplinary Studies, CRIM, in Cuernavaca, for inviting us, and the Faculty of Economics who are hosting us today. And in person, we're very grateful to Lourdes Arispe for inviting us, to Rolando Cordera for hosting us too. And we have been extremely well looked after by Erendira Serrano from CRIM. And thank you to the National Autonomous University of Mexico for hosting us for a stay. Richard will speak first, then I will speak for a little, and then he'll take over once again.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. Although Kate and I have spoken in so many countries around the world, this is the first time we've been in Mexico, and so it's a special pleasure to be here. We have a whole body of work, of research to tell you about, really increasing people's understanding of the effects of inequality, of the effects of bigger or smaller income differences within a population. We were writing our book quite a long time ago. We celebrated the 5th anniversary of it recently, before inequality was much discussed. You know, it was just before the financial crisis. And since then, there has been an extraordinary change in the attention given to inequality. These are some examples. You've already heard a mention of President Barack Obama saying that inequality is the defining challenge of our time. But Pope Francis says it's the root of social ills. Christine Lagarde, the director of the International Monetary Fund, and also Ban Ki-moon at the UN have made similar statements about how absolutely crucial it is to tackle inequality. Our message is basically as simple as this, that the more income inequality, the bigger the income differences between rich and poor in a society, the more it has of a whole range of social problems, health and social problems. We're going to take you through that data. We're going to take you through the data mainly looking at the rich developed societies. We have only a few slides that have Mexico on it, partly because of problems of getting comparable data between countries, but also because what we're really going to do is telling you about pathways through which we are affected by inequality that have been ignored. And everyone understands that if there is great inequality and it creates poverty, we all know that poverty, ill health, not having enough food, all the problems of material deprivation, those are well understood. We're going to talk about other aspects of inequality which are much easier to demonstrate on the rich developed countries. However, what we are going to talk about works at all levels of economic development. On this slide, you'll see infant mortality rates for countries at different levels of GNP. So on the left, you have poorer countries, on the right, richer countries. And those three lines are for countries with different levels of inequality. So the blue line is countries with high inequality. And all the way through the course of economic development, they have higher infant mortality rates than the green line at the bottom with low inequality. But you see, when you get into the right-hand end of that, the rich countries, GNP per capita, no longer makes much difference. And that allows us to concentrate on the other effects of inequality. So, in a way, that slide I've just shown you is the same as this one, but the other way up. Infant mortality gets better by going down. This is life expectancy, which gets better by going up. And you see there are rapid rises in life expectancy in the early stages of economic development. And then in the rich countries, it levels out. It doesn't level out because we've got to the limits of human life expectancy. It's still rising as fast as it ever did. Every 10 years that passes, we get another 2 or 3 years life expectancy. And that's been true for the last 100 or 150 years in many of the developed countries. This graph, though, is important because it shows that in the rich countries on the right, GNP per capita makes no difference. It's also important because if you look at happiness or other measures of well-being, you get the same pattern, rapid rises in the early stages of development and then leveling off. So what this curve is really a curve of diminishing returns to economic growth. You know, in poorer countries, it's important for people to have higher material standards. But as you get more and more of everything, it makes less and less difference. We're going to focus on those countries on the top right where increased material standards no longer matter. This data is all cross-sectional, but when people look at it over time, you find, again, no relationship between economic growth and the rising life expectancy. You can look at changes over 40 years, and there's still no relationship between them in those rich countries. So the countries we're really going to concentrate on are these ones. That's exactly the data that was on the top right-hand part of that curve I showed you earlier. And you see that countries like Israel, New Zealand, Greece, Portugal, they're half as rich as Norway and USA, and it has no consequences for life expectancy at all. So once you've got to that level of living, economic growth no longer matters. And that's really important thing to recognize as we become aware of the environmental limits to growth and the dangers of climate change and global warming. But within all our countries, there are these astonishing social gradients in health. This is small area data, neighborhoods in England and Wales. I'm sorry it's not Mexican data, but what you're seeing is the small neighborhoods, the poorest ones on the right, have short life expectancy, and the richest on the left have longer life expectancy. But that's not a difference just between the poor and everyone else. This is a gradient right away across society. To understand it, it's no good thinking about the homeless or people without enough food. You also have to have an explanation of why the people just below the top don't do as well as the ones at the top. So you need a different kind of theory. But look, I've shown you a paradox. In the last graph, I showed you that income differences between the countries didn't matter. But income differences within countries look as if they're extraordinarily important. You find these kind of gradients in health in, well, all the countries in which people have looked. There's a huge research industry on health inequalities around the globe, and so these are shown over and over again. But why does income matter within societies and not between it in the rich world? The explanation is that within societies, we're looking at the effects of relative income or social position, where we are in relation to each other in society. And as you get that idea that it's about relativities rather than absolute standards, you should start to think, well, what would happen if we made the differences between us bigger or smaller? What would the effects be? And Kate's going to tell you about that, but just before she does, in a way you can sum up some of what I've been saying like this, that there is a sort of simple view of inequality where people think just about poverty, about absolute material standards, and I think many people in the developed world thought inequality didn't matter now that, you know, even the less well-off have air conditioning and cars and DVDs and all the rest of it. But there is another effect of inequality that we are really talking about, and it's a psychosocial effect, a psychological effect, to do with dominance and subordination. superiority and inferiority, and the psychological consequences of that, how it affects our sense of self-worth, all those kinds of issues. But I'm going to hand over to Kate now, who's going to show you more of the data, and then I'll come back and summarize.
Have you got the...
Very easy.
Thank you. So, Richard has shown you how life expectancy is unrelated to average wealth in different countries or average levels of income, standards of living. But for the rest of the talk, really, we're going to talk about how health and social problems are related to income distribution instead of the average, how they're related to income inequality. And the measure that we're going to use and show you in the following figures is the ratio of the incomes of the people in the top 20% of the population to those in the bottom 20% of the population. So really, it's saying how much richer are the richest fifth compared to the poorest fifth in each country. And here you can see that for the... Oh, didn't mean to do that.
Forwards.
For the more equal countries on the left, Japan, Finland, Norway, Sweden, the top fifth of the population have incomes that are about 3.5 to 4 times those at the bottom. Whereas in the more unequal of the rich, developed market economies, the UK, Portugal, the USA, Singapore, it's 7 to close to 10 times as much. So that's the scale of the income inequality differences across different countries. And we wanted to look at a whole range of health and social problems, understanding that if inequality is affecting us through psychosocial mechanisms, it will affect more than just our health. It will affect our behavior, our cognitive performance, our emotions as well. So what we looked for were data on health and social problems that had those social gradients like Richard showed you before for life expectancy. More problems at the bottom of society, but a gradient all the way up to the top. And we were looking for measures that are reliably measured, where the data can be compared across different countries. And we created an index of health and social problems, and it contains all the things that are in that list on the left. So it contains life expectancy for different countries, educational attainment, that's the maths and literacy scores of 15-year-olds, infant mortality rates, homicides, imprisonment, prevalence of teenage births, levels of trust, obesity, mental illness, and that includes drug and alcohol addiction, and social mobility. And if we score all of these different countries on that index, here, the countries that are at the top of the graph are those that are doing worst on this measure. So at the very top on the left, there's the USA. Towards the top on the right is Portugal. And here, countries' performance on that index of health and social problems is once again being plotted against a measure of average income, so against gross national income per capita. And you can see on the right that countries can be sort of equally rich and have very different levels of performance on this index. So with the USA doing much, much worse than Norway, even though they have very similar levels of gross national income per capita. And then over on the poorer side, contrast Portugal and Spain, for instance. But if instead of plotting our index against this average measure of income, we plot it against a measure of income distribution, the one I just showed you, we get a very different picture. We sometimes say this is such a close relationship, it looks more like physics than social sciences. The countries on the left are the much more equal ones. Down there you have Japan, Norway, Sweden, Finland, doing much better on the index of health and social problems. And then on the left, the UK, Portugal, USA, performing much worse. It's so close that if you know a country's level of income inequality, you can very, very accurately predict its performance on this index of health and social problems. Now, we knew when we were writing our book that the picture we were going to present would be somewhat controversial. We knew that people would think that the relationships we were showing were probably there just because of the countries we chose to look at. We actually chose them systematically. But anyway, you can take away the countries at the bottom of the distribution and those at the top, and you still have a relationship amongst the rest. And we repeated all our analyses, and I don't think we're going to show many, if any of these, but on the 50 United States within America, and we see the exact same relationships, a high level of health and social problems in the more unequal of the 50 US states. But we also knew that people might think we'd picked the health and social problems that we looked at to suit ourselves, so we repeated everything again with somebody else's index of outcomes. And we chose the UNICEF Index of Child Wellbeing, which was first published in 2007. It caused a lot of media attention in the UK because we came absolute bottom. We have the worst child well-being among all the rich countries, which wasn't very popular, as you can imagine. It's the only time we ever do worse than the USA on these measures. But here you can see that, once again, child well-being is not related to national income per head. It is related to income inequality. So again, the more equal countries, up here Sweden, Finland, Norway, the Netherlands, performing much better on this index of child well-being, and the more unequal countries doing worse. And this index contains 40 different components about how kids are doing. Everything from their health, whether they get their vaccinations, to whether they get along with their parents or their peers, to how well they're doing in school, whether they eat 5 fruits and vegetables every day, and subjective well-being as well, how they feel about their lives. As I say, this was published in 2007. UNICEF published a new index of child well-being in 2013. It is also related to income inequality. But more interestingly, because we've now had these 2 reports, we can look at change in child well-being over time in relation to change in income inequality. And in this slide, what we're showing is that there is a statistically significant relationship between inequality changes and changes in child well-being. So those countries that became more unequal, I'd point out Sweden towards the bottom right, their child well-being performance declined, and countries that became more equal did better. They moved up the rankings. So I'm now going to show you a few graphs that show the individual components of our index of health and social problems in relation to inequality. And mostly it's because I want to show you the scale of the differences between different countries. So I'll start with trust. These data come from the World Values Survey. They take random samples of the adult population in each country, and they ask them a very simple question: do you think most people can be trusted, or do you feel they're out to get you? And in the more equal countries, about 2/3 of the population trust others, and it drops to less than 1/5 in the more unequal ones. We see exactly the same picture in the 50 US states, and the scale of differences is pretty similar, around 2/3 of the population trusting each other in the more equal states on the left, and it dropping down to below 1/3, round about 1/5 in the more unequal ones. And on this chart, Mexico is included. This again is data from the World Values Survey, and you are 3rd from the bottom. 26% of you feel that other people can be trusted. And we think that what inequality does to trust is a really profound and important way in which it has an impact on society. Trust is a good measure of social capital. of social cohesion, of what it feels like to live in different societies, what the quality of social relationships are like. So if you think about, for instance, being a woman walking home alone at night, it's probably going to feel very different in countries at the bottom of this graph to those at the top. Or if you are a young man and you're walking along the street and you see a group of young men across the street from you, how do you feel about them and walking up towards them? What are relationships like on public transport or in the workplace or on the school playground? So generalized trust in each other, we think, is a very important marker of the quality of the social fabric, and income inequality seems to tear that fabric apart. These are levels of mental illness in different societies. They come from the World Health Organization's consortium set up to provide comparable measures of mental illness. And what we're seeing measured up the side here is the percent of adults with any mental illness in the past year. So it's less than 10% in the more equal countries, 23% in the UK and Australia, and more than a quarter of the population in the USA at the top left. Similarly, drug use is more common in more unequal countries. These data come from the United Nations, and it's an index of the use of opiates, cocaine, cannabis, ecstasy, and amphetamines, and again, a higher level of use in the more unequal countries. Infant mortality rates are higher in more unequal countries. Here you can see the difference in rates. And we sometimes point out, it looks, if you're just looking at the scatter of country names here, as if the line, the regression line, should actually go like that, because a lot of people don't notice Singapore down here at the bottom. In a way, I think this proves that we're very honest about our data, because Singapore certainly doesn't fit the picture on this particular outcome. It has the lowest level of infant mortality in the world, but it's the most unequal of the societies that we look at. It turns out that the large migrant population in Singapore have to leave if they marry, the women have to leave if they marry or become pregnant. And as the migrant workers are the poorest in Singaporean society, in a way they're missing the population that would have the highest level of infant mortality from their statistics, because they're not allowed to stay. We look at adult obesity. We also look at child overweight. Here are rates of adult obesity. The percentage ranging from much less than 10 in the most equal country, Japan, to over a third in the USA. And I know that, high levels of obesity are increasingly an issue for you here in Mexico. But we see these relationships for adults and for children, for men and for women. So moving on from health, we've also looked at levels of violence, and the best comparable measure of violence across different societies is the murder rate. Murders tend to be reported everywhere, and they tend to be accurately counted. Here are the homicide rates for the US states, the red circles, and the Canadian provinces, which are the blue triangles. And really, I want to show you this. These are data from colleagues in Canada, the scale of the differences. So in the more equal of the Canadian provinces, there are about 15 murders per million people per year. Up in the most unequal of the US states, it's 150 per million people per year. So a tenfold difference, closely related to income inequality. Here's a graph showing the same thing for the OECD countries and South and Central America around the year 2000. So some of the OECD countries clustered down here, but here's Mexico, right on the line. So its level of homicides, really what you would expect given its level of inequality. And imprisonment rates are higher in more unequal countries as well. These data for our set of rich developed countries, again, are, unlike most of the graphs we show, are presented on a log scale. And for those of you who never liked maths at school or have forgotten it all, that means that the distance up the side here between 10 and 100 is the same as between 100 and 1,000. And we have to use a log scale to show you these data, otherwise we couldn't fit the USA onto the graph. It'd be up there, somewhere up there. But levels of imprisonment are not simply driven by levels of crime. So researchers in the United States looking at state levels of imprisonment estimate that only about a third of the change in the prevalence of imprisonment is due to changes in the crime rate. It is much more to do with how a society chooses to treat people who come into the criminal justice system, the harshness of the judicial system, if you will. So it's to do with the length of time that people get sent to prison for, the numbers that get sent, the percentage that get sent of those who come through the judicial system, and the repeat offending rate. So in the most unequal of these countries here, extremely high levels of imprisonment. We know that, for instance, in the state of California, there are hundreds of people in prison for life under the 3 strikes or you're out law, even though that final offence or their 3 offences might be quite minor. And in the UK, for instance, we send women to prison daily for shoplifting, no threat to society whatsoever. So it is all to do with how societies choose to treat people within them. Again, data from a colleague, another Canadian colleague, he has looked at a measure of what we might think of as violence in school children. He's looking at school bullying, and here he's looking at the percentage of children who respond in the WHO's Health Behaviour of School Children survey that they've bullied other people. So it's perpetrators of bullying rather than the victims. But again, it's significantly related to inequality. So perhaps reflecting that lack of trust that we see in more unequal societies. Apart from disrupting the social fabric and increasing violence and aggression and affecting health, inequality affects the life chances of our young people. It really alters their sense of their life trajectories, the opportunities available to them. For young women, we see that teenage birth rates are much higher in more unequal countries. UK is the highest in Western Europe. There's the USA up here. But again, look at the difference, for instance, between Spain and Portugal. For young men, we have seen that the juvenile homicide rate is higher in more unequal US states than more equal ones. So for young women, their reaction to inequality is to choose to become mothers early, to drop out of education, etc. For young men, it's often to become involved in violence and aggression. School attainment is worse in more unequal societies. These data are for scores on numeracy tests. And have we got Mexico on here, Richard? No, but we have we have some rich and Eastern European countries as well, a rather larger set than we often look at. But we find that scores on reading, literacy, and science are lower in more unequal countries and lower in more unequal US states, and more kids drop out of high school in more unequal societies. And so you won't be surprised to know that social mobility is much lower in more unequal societies. What we're looking at here is what economists call intergenerational income elasticity, but put simply, it's whether rich parents have rich children, poor parents have children who grow up to be poor. This is looking at a number of different countries, including some from Latin America on the right. Oh, sorry, I'm not very good at left and right. On the right-hand side of the chart, and the more equal societies on the left. And we often point out the position of the United States here, which among the rich developed countries has the worst social mobility. This is the land of opportunity, you know, the land of the American dream. So we sometimes say that actually if you want to live the American dream,